not quite. He was close, not there yet, but almost. It felt acceptable, close enough to wait. Nothing seemed incomplete. There was still room to adjust, still time to refine. Nothing demanded clarity. Nothing indicated it was already finished. At the time, waiting felt precise. The final step didn't arrive. It had already passed. Quietly, without announcement, there was no moment left to complete it. Nothing happens. Still open. It hadn't closed, not yet. Everything remained possible. Nothing had been decided. Nothing had been removed. There was still space. Options remained visible, at least on the surface. Nothing forced a choice. Nothing limited the path. Nothing suggested the outcome was already fixed. At the time, openness felt real. The options didn't disappear. They just stopped leading anywhere. One by one. There was no moment where they clearly ended. Nothing happens. Almost clear. He understood most of it. Not everything, but enough. It seemed manageable, coherent. Nothing felt uncertain. The gaps didn't seem important. They could wait. Nothing required precision. Nothing demanded clarity. Nothing suggested the missing part mattered. At the time, understanding felt sufficient. Later, the missing part defined everything. Not loudly, just completely. There was no moment where he could revisit it. Nothing happens. Not necessary. He considered it briefly, then dismissed it. It didn't seem required. Everything already worked, or seemed to. Nothing needed to change. There was no pressure, no visible consequence. Nothing required attention. Nothing forced revision. Nothing indicated it would matter later. At the time, ignoring it felt efficient. Later, it was the only thing that mattered. Everything else remained, but didn't work. There was no point where it could be added back. Nothing happens. Still fine. Everything looked normal. Nothing unusual. It felt stable. There were no signs, no interruptions. Nothing seemed wrong. The situation held quietly. Nothing required attention. Nothing demanded change. Nothing suggested it had already shifted. At the time, stability felt real. The change had already occurred before it was visible. Everything looked the same, but wasn't. There was no moment where it became clear. Nothing happens. Almost right. It felt correct. Not perfect, but close. Enough to continue. Enough to trust. Nothing seemed off. The difference was small, barely noticeable. Nothing required correction. Nothing demanded doubt. Nothing suggested the difference would grow. At the time, it felt accurate. The difference didn't grow suddenly. It accumulated quietly until it replaced everything else. There was no moment where it could be corrected. Nothing happens. Not far. He wasn't far, not really. Close enough to relax. The distance seemed manageable, small. Nothing felt out of reach. There was still time, still space to arrive. Nothing required urgency. Nothing signaled delay. Nothing suggested the distance was increasing. At the time, it felt near. The distance didn't change, but the path did, quietly, without direction. There was no moment where it could be shortened. Nothing happens